Hello, everybody, and welcome to a video where I'm going to be breaking down some of the 17 lands draft data for Neon Dynasty, and specifically addressing one of the massive pitfalls that you can fall into if you are looking at this data yourself. Before I dive in though, I want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, feedback, and whether you'd like to see more 17 lands videos in the future. If you've never seen 17 Lands, then it is a site where users can sign up and it will track their arena data, and then you can look at that data yourself, and it will also aggregate that data into the 17 Lands database and provide all of these numbers that you can then look at. That is the aggregate of all users. One important caveat is that because the users of 17 Lands are more invested and generally better players than the average player, the average win rate of a 17 Lands player is around 56% in this current set. And so that means that the cards should be measured with respect to that as a baseline, rather than like, oh, the card is above average because it's got an above 50% win rate, which almost all the cards will, because the users of the cards are just a little bit better in terms of gameplay skill. So one of the big pitfalls that I see people falling into is they look at the 17 lands numbers and they treat it as if it is gospel. Specifically, this one column here, this games in hand win rate, which is, if you hover over it, says win rate in hand, opener, or drawn. So what this is taken to mean is if I have this card in my hand at some point, whether that is by drawing the card or by having it in my opening hand, this is the amount of percentage points that I will have of winning that game. And it's a number that people gravitate towards because it can simplify the card down into one number. But the downside is that cards are more complex than that. And one of the big issues I have with people just looking at the data in general in many cases is they just discount a lot of the factors of what you need to do in order to win. If you just took cards based on which had a higher games in hand win percentage, you would be shooting yourself in the foot in many ways, because you're giving up on the small pieces of a deck that you actually have to assemble and play, rather than just, for example, if a card with a higher win percentage is like a 4-drop or a 5-drop, you can't just jam infinite 4 and 5-drops into your deck. You need to have stuff lower on the curve so you don't just get crushed. And that's not really factored into these sorts of cards. Another thing that is worth noting is flexibility is important in many cases. Where there's a card that can fit into multiple strategies and be a solid role player in all of them, oftentimes that's worth taking earlier, even if it doesn't have quite as high stats. But the biggest thing that bugs me about 17 lands data is when people say, well, these are the top commons according to 17 lands, or this card is better than this card because 17 lands says so. And that's something that I'm going to be talking about here, and one of the massive risks that you can fall into. So what people do when they're trying to show that the card X is better than card Y, or these are the top commons, or things of that nature, is they simplify it only down to games in hand win rate. They select common, and then they sort it by win rate. And they see something like, oh my gosh, Virus Beetle is the best common in the set. I'm going to use this information to crush my opponents. I'm going to be taking Virus Beetle super highly, and it's going to be great. They'll be like, oh, Okiba Reckoner Raid's tied. Okay, that's great. And they're like, oh yeah, Network Disruptor, number 3 common. This card is clearly just like going to crush my opponents because everything, I know everything that's going on, and this card's going to be great. Now, first of all, massive caveat, if you're looking at this data and you primarily play best of 3, it's important to note that this is only data for Premier Draft. You can sort by which data you want to look at, and the cards that are the best in each format are going to vary. So if you're playing at FNM, it's going to be different if you want to use like traditional draft and sort it by games in hand win rate. The win rate average is much higher in best of 3, so the new baseline is no longer this like 56%. It's going to be higher than that. But you will have different cards like in the spots, generally speaking. So we're not going to be focusing on that, but because there's a lot more data for this and a lot of people are playing best of 1, and this is generally where I wanted to focus my efforts here. But keep in mind that is always something to be aware of. Now, people, when they look at this games in hand win rate, they're like, oh my gosh, this is clearly incredible, and we're going to be focusing on one card in particular that was curious to me why it was so high on the list, because it has a massive number of games in hand played. And Network Disruptor, when I first saw it, was the sort of card where I thought it would only find a home in a very specific archetype, which was a ninja strategy, where you play this on turn 1, and then you attack your opponent with it, and ninjutsu something in because it's a cheap evasive flyer, and then you can play it later in the game to tap your opponent's blockers so your ninjas can connect once more. But if you look at the number of games played, it's got the second highest number of games played, which means that either this card is just being played in every strategy as the second most played common, or there's something else going on. And I figured that it was probably going to be a situation where the latter was the case. So the first thing I did, I'm just going to simplify this a little bit further. by just looking at the blue card. So we can really hone in on this network disruptor. I guess it doesn't really matter, but this way it'll be the top front and center network disruptor. And what we see is if you look at opening hand and drawn in game, these are the metrics for when the card is in your opening hand versus when it's drawn in the game. And if you look down the list of cards, you'll see there's a pattern. This card is 15,000 in the opening hand, about 30,000 in the game. 16,000 in the opening hand, 32,000 in the game. 16,000, 35,000, 28, 54. It's roughly double the number of games when your games drawn versus games in opening hand. And I think that's just generally reflective of what percentage of the games are going to go to a specific turn, how long the game's going to last in general, and how you're going to end up like playing those games out. And like these are just like the percentage of your opening of the games that like have these cards in your opening hand. So maybe you'll see 21 cards in an average game, so roughly a third of the time it's going to be in your opening hand, the other 2/3 it's not. However, when we look at the network disruptor, it defies the pattern, and it defies it by a large enough margin that it's worth investigating. Nearly 10,000 more games drawn than in the opening hand. Also, you wouldn't expect to see this. Opening hand win rate, 59.9. Games drawn win rate, 62.5. So you see there's like a 2.5 percentage point jump in terms of games drawn versus opening hand, which just makes no sense when you actually think about what Network Disruptor does as a card. It's a 1-drop. You want to be playing it on turn 1. It's an evasive creature. If you play this on turn 1, it could hit the opponent like 5 times and deal 5 damage before they get a reach creature in play, or you can start ninjutsuing things into play. It's like clearly way better on turn 1 than later in the game. And so that made no sense to me. I was like, why would Network Disruptor not only have such a higher number of games drawn, but also much higher games drawn win percentage? And that's when I decided to dig deeper into what the metric means. I clicked on metric definitions, and it turns out that the games drawn win rate is the win rate of games where an instance of this card was in the hand, not counting cards from the opening hand. So it is not the cards you are drawing from your deck, it is the cards that go to your hand that were not initially in your opening hand. So drawn or put into your hand for any other reason. So with Network Disruptor, when you are ninjutsuing this card back to your hand, it is counting that as another card drawn, which is artificially inflating the stats by treating it as if it is drawn as a separate card in your deck. Now, I don't blame 17 lands for this. There are simplifications that have to be made, but clearly the ninjutsu mechanic messes with these metrics and messes with these stats because it just creates so many more games drawn than you would expect from a card. Like, it's 10,000 more games, and when you're ninjutsuing the card, that is when things are going the best for you. That is when you are having the most success, your deck is churning, you've played your Network Disruptor, and you've ninjutsued it back to your hand, presumably in the early turns of the game. You're starting to snowball against your opponent, and you're seeing this real big impact of a card that should be best in the opening hand actually having a higher performance when it's drawn, just because so many of the games where it's drawn are games where you're ninjutsuing it back to your hand and getting that extra value, which is really something that you have to be able to factor in. And I've got a feeling that a lot of people that are looking at Network Disruptor aren't looking at the opening hand or drawn in game stats. They're just looking at this games in hand win percentage. They're not even looking at this number of games. They're just looking at this percentage number, and they're saying, well, clearly Network Disruptor is the top blue common and it's a card I should be taking. But what these numbers tell me is that if you don't have any ninjutsu in your deck, Network Disruptor is not really a card you care about, because it's not going to be doing the stuff that it's built to be doing, and a lot of the success of the card is coming from this win rate that you're getting when everything is going smoothly and you're able to ninjutsu it. And I think that that is something that's really worth knowing, and really something that like kind of is like almost like very important, but that people just aren't able to pick up about the card. And when you're looking at just the pure games in hand win rate, you're not getting the full story. You're not really getting the deck context, oh, I don't really want to first pick a Network Disruptor because I don't think I'm necessarily going to end up with a bunch of ninjas. Maybe it's the sort of card that I take once I have some ninjas because it's a really good enabler for them. But if I'm not able to just leverage this like random discrepancy in these numbers, the card's not going to perform as well. So let's go back to just all of the commons in terms of the color, and we see opening hand win rate for Virus Beetle lower than the game's drawn win rate, which is also weird because it's a 2-drop that has like a relatively like mediocre impact over the course of the game. Now, the numbers do kind of line up in terms of the opening hand being like half as large as the game's drawn. So maybe it's just because maybe you nab their last card or something of that nature. But again, this could be a ninjutsu effect where there are a percentage of games where you get to return Virus Beetle to your hand because your opponent doesn't have a 2-drop, and you just get to then make them discard a second card. And you can kind of just go down the line here and see like, well, Spirited Companion maybe has that effect as well, where you're able to bounce it back to your hand and you get to boost your win rate by doing something like that. So with Spirited Companion in particular, maybe you're using like a geothermal kami to get it back into your hand or something of that nature. A card like Twisted Embrace, maybe you're able to do something similar where you get to inflate this games drawn win percentage or things of that nature. It's like, it's not just about looking at this games in hand win rate number. It's not just about sorting it by this is the card that is best according to win rate, and so clearly I have to take it. Let me just demonstrate something very, very crazy to you. Games drawn win rate, Imperial Oath is number 1. Network Disruptor is number 2. That should be a red flag where it's like, wow, this 6 drop that has a massive impact on the game. The opening hand win rate much lower than its games drawn win rate because it's a 6 drop. And so you're not always going to get to play it when you have it in your opening hand, but when you draw it, it's doing great work for you. Whereas Network Disruptor, literally in second place and not that far behind Imperial Oath, that's just telling you the numbers aren't telling the full story and that the whole kind of data set is almost corrupted in some ways and not really giving you a full impression of which card is going to actually be something you're interested in. If you wanted to look at 17 lands data and get some actionable info, look for things that don't make sense. That's really where I find it to be the most useful, where you can say, wow, I thought this card was really good and it's performing terribly in all metrics. Maybe I'm missing something. Or this card is performing great in all metrics. Maybe this strategy, or you have to kind of dive deeper than just looking at the one column. It really frustrates me to see people just kind of using the games in hand win rate as like a rote tool. And going back to this like games drawn win rate, just because Imperial Oath has such a high games in hand win percentage doesn't mean that you want to have like 10 copies of it in your deck, because if you have multiple copies in your opening hand, it's not going to do as well, and you would rather just have a couple copies that you can maybe draw over the course of the game. And so maybe you don't have to take it as highly because it's not the sort of card that you necessarily want to be like having 5 copies of in your deck because it is a 6 drop. It's like, these are the sorts of factors that come into play. There's a whole lot of things you can do. You can look at like when the card is picked on average to see like if there's certain effects you have to prioritize. Because like if all of the cards that aren't removal spells have like higher win rates than the removal spells, doesn't mean that your deck can function without having a removal spell to be able to deal with your opponent's like bomb creature. So you just need to have access to certain kinds of effects to be able to play limited. And so you'll have to be able to take some of those cards over some of these better cards. And that's why I get a little bit frustrated when I see people referring to these are the best cards, or these cards are better than other cards, or things of that nature, because it's all about building a deck versus just taking the raw, like what the number says is the best card. And as we've just seen, the numbers aren't always going to be telling you the full story unless you dive deeper and really understand them. So some of the dangers of 17lands.com, I do think that it can be a useful tool in the right circumstances, but I think people put way too much stock in it as well, and that it's not always as useful as it would seem when you're looking for these like particular cards and things of that nature. So yeah, that is going to do it for this video though. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you made it all the way till the end of the video, in the comment section down below, leave hashtag disrupting data, because hopefully we've learned a little bit of stuff about the network disruptor, maybe something that you had never considered before with 17 lands. And I'm hoping that you can take this with you going forward. If you ever are looking at 17 lands data, don't just look at this one column of data and kind of trust that number alone. It's not really going to tell you the full story, and it is a pretty dangerous thing to just start making your picks based on one column of numbers from one specific situation and just kind of going with that, because it is, as I've been saying, more important to build a cohesive deck with a cohesive game plan that you understand what it's trying to do, rather than just following numbers because they're numbers and people like numbers. So that is going to do it for this video though. If you did enjoy it, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more content, comment below questions, thoughts, and feedback. And yeah, if you would like to support my content and support videos like this in the future, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas, linked in the description down below. That's going to do it for this one though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.